The restaurant was a cathedral of wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, glimmering over white linen tables that were set with gold-rimmed china and cutlery polished to a mirror's shine. Waiters moved like shadows, silent yet attentive, and every corner of the room breathed exclusivity. On this evening, seated at the very center, was a man everyone knew, at least by reputation. Alexander Crown, the billionaire, the man whose name made headlines, whose fortune was whispered about in boardrooms, whose presence usually turned heads. But tonight, as he leaned back in his tailored navy suit, the glow of his aura dimmed. His jaw tightened when the waiter, an older man with a trembling hand, returned to the table. In that elegant room filled with power brokers and celebrities, silence fell as though the chandeliers themselves had stopped breathing. The waiter's words cut sharper than a blade. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry, but your card, it's been declined." The world seemed to tilt. Declined for Alexander Crown. The murmurs began instantly, like fire crackling across dry grass. A few guests turned their heads. A socialite at the next table stifled a laugh behind her diamond-studded hand. Cameras from discreet diners' phones angled just slightly, pretending not to film, yet capturing every detail. Alexander's face burned. He reached for another card, black, embossed, limitless, at least it should have been. He slid it across the table. The waiter hesitated, ran it through the machine, and then returned with the same hollow look of pity. "Declined again, sir." A storm brewed behind Alexander's eyes. He wasn't used to failure, let alone humiliation in public. His life had been a fortress of control, of power, of money that always spoke louder than any voice in the room. But tonight, his fortress was crumbling in the most brutal way possible, in front of the world. "Try it again," Alexander said, his voice low, sharp, commanding. The waiter obeyed. But the outcome was the same. Declined. The whispers grew louder now, feeding the air with judgment and cruel curiosity. For the first time in years, Alexander Crown felt small. Invisible wealth was worthless when the machine blinked red. And then, it happened. A small voice broke through the tension, fragile yet clear. "Excuse me, sir. I can help." Everyone turned. Standing near the corner of the room was a little girl, no older than 9. Her dress was plain, faded at the seams, her shoes scuffed as though they had walked miles. She did not belong in this palace of marble and silk. She clutched a tiny coin purse in her hand, its fabric worn but carefully stitched, as if it had been mended 100 times. Her wide brown eyes shimmered with innocence and courage. I can pay," she said, stepping forward, her voice trembling yet fierce with determination. The restaurant gasped. A billionaire brought low and a poor little girl offering to save him. It was unthinkable, impossible, absurd. Yet she stood there, her tiny hand wrapped around her coin purse, ready to do what no one else dared. Alexander's chest tightened as his gaze locked with hers. For the first time in decades, someone looked at him not with envy or fear, but with unshaken kindness, and in that moment, the billionaire knew his night was about to change forever. But who was this little girl, and why would she risk everything to save a stranger? For a long, unbroken moment, Alexander Crown simply stared at the child. His world, built from numbers, contracts, and power, had never prepared him for a moment like this. In boardrooms, he crushed opponents. In courtrooms, he commanded armies of lawyers. But here, in the silence of a golden restaurant, he was powerless, and it was a little girl who dared to extend him a lifeline. He felt the eyes of the wealthy drilling into his back, their smirks and whispers painting him as a man finally stripped of his crown. Shame gnawed at him. But somewhere in the depths of that humiliation, something else stirred. A memory. A pang he had buried under decades of success, because Alexander Crown hadn't always been a billionaire. Years ago, before private jets and skyscraper offices bore his name, Alexander had been a boy in a small town, living with nothing but hunger and hope. He had known the feeling of empty cupboards, of shoes with holes, of staring at grocery store windows with longing. His rise had been merciless, built from the fire of wanting to escape that life forever. But wealth, once attained, had hardened him. He had promised never to feel powerless again. And yet here he was. The little girl moved closer now, clutching her tiny coin purse against her chest. I don't have much," she whispered as if confessing a secret. "But you can use it." "You look like you really need help." The waiter blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Diners shifted uncomfortably, their worldviews colliding. A billionaire in need of charity from a child. It was unthinkable. And yet the raw honesty of her offer silenced the room. Alexander leaned forward, his voice quieter than it had been in years. "What's your name?" "Lila," she said softly, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles, as though giving her name was another kind of gift. Something cracked open in Alexander's chest. That name, spoken with such innocence, cut through the thick fog of pride. He wanted to refuse her. He wanted to stand, throw his shoulders back, and reclaim control. But the truth was sharper. At this moment, he was helpless. The maitre d', desperate to dissolve the tension, cleared his throat. "Perhaps the gentleman has another form of payment?" Alexander's hands tightened into fists. He had no answer. All of his cards were frozen. He knew why. The headlines had been whispering for weeks about his empire, about investigations, about missing funds. His fortune, the very symbol of his life, was trembling at the edge of collapse. And tonight, it had chosen this place, this moment, to betray him. And so he looked again at Lila, the girl with nothing offering him everything. But what kind of child would do this? Why was she here, alone in a restaurant where a glass of water cost more than her entire purse could hold? The question wrapped around him like a riddle, and as Lila stood her ground, the answer began to unravel, a truth that would pierce deeper than he could have ever imagined, because Lila wasn't just any little girl. She carried her own story of loss, hunger, and courage, a story about to collide with his in ways neither could foresee. The maitre d's attempt to smooth over the moment only made it worse. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were daggers. "Did you hear?" His card was declined twice. Crown Industries must be finished. Imagine, a billionaire begging a child for help. Phones were discreetly raised. Recording, because in the age of instant scandal, no fall from grace went undocumented. Alexander sat frozen, his throat tight, pride clawing at him like a beast that refused to die. He wanted to roar, to stand, to prove them wrong, but what proof did he have left? Numbers on a screen meant nothing when the machine blinked red. His enemies would feast on this moment. Tomorrow's headlines would scream billionaire brought low by a child. The waiter, embarrassed, shifted uneasily. "Sir, perhaps if you step outside we could resolve this matter privately." Privately. The word was a dagger. It meant one thing, removal. They wanted him out. Him, Alexander Crown. The man who once had restaurants begging to host him for the prestige of his presence. Now he was a nuisance to be escorted away before the scandal poisoned their perfect image. His chair scraped loudly against the marble floor as he stood, his face ashen. He could feel their stares like burning coals pressing into his skin. And then, just as he was about to turn away in defeat, Lila's voice rose again. "You can take my money," she said louder this time, holding out her coin purse with trembling hands. Her voice carried across the restaurant, piercing the veil of cruel laughter. For a heartbeat, the room fell silent again. Alexander's chest tightened. Her tiny hand shook, but her eyes were steady. In them he saw no judgment, no ridicule, only determination. The maitre d' frowned, his polished smile faltering. "Young lady, this is hardly appropriate," but Alexander raised a hand, silencing him. For the first time in his life, he accepted something he had always despised. Help. He bent down slightly, lowering himself to Lila's level, and spoke in a voice only she could hear. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Lila swallowed, her gaze soft. "Because you look sad, and I know what that feels like." Those words hit him harder than any boardroom battle. He, the man who had built empires, who had buried weakness beneath skyscrapers of steel and glass, he looked sad, and a child could see it. Her coin purse jingled faintly as she pressed it into his hand. Inside were a few crumpled bills, a handful of coins, maybe enough for a loaf of bread, certainly not for a billionaire's dinner. Yet somehow, in that fragile offering, it felt like the richest treasure he had ever held. The waiter looked at Alexander uncertainly. The room was still waiting. Alexander's pride screamed at him to refuse, to storm out and reclaim his dignity. But his heart, heavy with exhaustion, whispered something else. Accept. As his fingers closed around the purse, gasps rippled through the restaurant. The billionaire had taken money from a child, and in that single humiliating act, His carefully constructed world came crashing down. But humiliation was only the beginning, for what Alexander would soon learn about Lila's life would strike far deeper than any public disgrace ever could. The maitre d' tried to regain composure, but his carefully rehearsed elegance was cracking. He leaned toward Alexander with forced politeness, his words sharp beneath the silk. "Sir, this is highly irregular. We cannot accept." But before he could finish, Alexander interrupted. His voice was steady, though inside he felt like a man standing on a fault line. "Put it toward the bill." A wave of disbelief swept through the restaurant. Guests leaned forward as though watching a gladiator's defeat in an arena. The waiter hesitated, looking down at the small purse in his hand. The jingling of coins inside was almost mocking against the backdrop of crystal and gold. It wasn't enough, not even close. But the weight of it wasn't in currency, it was in courage. Lila, standing so small against the towering grandeur of the restaurant, looked up at Alexander with wide, hopeful eyes. "Did it help?" she asked softly. Her question cut through him. Did it help? In money, no. But in something far more precious, in humanity, it did. For years, Alexander had lived behind steel walls of pride, seeing kindness as weakness. Yet here was a child, stripped of all the shields adults carried, giving freely. He forced a faint smile, though it trembled at the corners. "More than you know," the maitre d' sighed, motioning discreetly to the staff. "The gentleman will settle his bill at another time. For tonight the matter is concluded." His voice was polished but sharp enough to slice. To the other diners, it meant one thing. The billionaire had been spared, not by wealth, but by pity. Alexander felt the weight of every eye as he led Lila out of the restaurant. The air outside was sharp and cold, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating judgment inside. Neon lights flickered across the street, reflecting off rain-soaked pavement. The night smelled of city smoke and distant rain, heavy with silence between them. "Why were you there?" Alexander finally asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual edge. Lila shrugged, her tiny shoulders rising against the chill. "I like to walk by the windows sometimes. The food looks pretty, like pictures in books. Sometimes they let me clear tables for a meal if I'm lucky. Tonight I just wanted to see the lights." Her honesty was a blade that sliced clean through his chest. She wasn't supposed to be here. Children weren't meant to linger outside places that flaunted wealth. Yet here she was, a ghost haunting the edges of luxury, surviving on scraps of kindness. "And your parents?" he asked carefully. Her eyes flickered down, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just me and Mama. She's sick a lot. I try to help, but sometimes it's hard." Alexander said nothing. For years he had sat at the top of the world, insulated from stories like hers. He read numbers, reports, statistics about poverty, but never faces, never voices. Now poverty had a face. It had a name. It was standing right beside him, shivering in the cold. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his throat. For the first time in decades, Alexander Crown felt powerless, not because of money, but because of a child's reality that no fortune could erase. And as they stood there on that lonely street, the billionaire wondered if their meeting was coincidence or fate. But just when Alexander thought the night couldn't cut deeper, a twist was waiting, one that would reveal the true danger shadowing both their lives. The city hummed around them, taxis darting past, neon signs buzzing, the rhythm of late-night footsteps echoing on wet pavement. Alexander walked beside Lila in silence, still clutching the memory of that tiny purse in his palm. He was used to transactions, deals sealed with signatures and lawyers. But what she had given him wasn't a transaction. It was trust. He glanced at her again, small and fragile beneath the streetlights, her breath misting in the cold. "Where do you live?" he asked. Lila pointed vaguely down the street. "Not far. Mama doesn't like me out late, but she'll understand." Something in her voice faltered, and Alexander caught it. He knew the sound of people hiding truths. He had heard it in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in whispers of employees terrified of losing everything. But from a child's lips, it pierced deeper. As they reached a corner, a shadow peeled away from the alley. A man, disheveled and reeking of alcohol, stumbled forward. His eyes glimmered with the dangerous hunger of desperation. "Hey!" the man slurred, his gaze darting between Alexander's suit and Lila's coin purse still peeking from her pocket. Got a little money for me? Or maybe that girl does. Lila instinctively stepped closer to Alexander, clutching his arm. He felt her tremble. Move along, Alexander said coldly, his old commanding tone sliding back into place. But the man only sneered. You think you're better than me, huh? Fancy suit, walking with kids on the street. Hand it over. It had been years since Alexander had felt fear like this. Not in markets or headlines, but raw, physical fear. He had bodyguards for moments like this. Except tonight there were none, just him and her. The man lunged, grabbing at Lila's coin purse. She gasped, holding it tight, refusing to let go. No! She cried, the same courage that made her offer it to Alexander, now burning against this stranger. Alexander acted on instinct. He shoved the man back with surprising strength, his voice a growl. Leave her alone! The drunkard stumbled, cursed, then finally retreated into the darkness, muttering threats that dissolved into the city's endless hum. Alexander's chest heaved as adrenaline surged through him. He looked down at Lila, who was still clinging to him, her little face pale but defiant. You shouldn't fight him, she whispered, her voice shaking. Men like that, they don't stop. Alexander crouched to meet her eyes. And girls like you shouldn't have to fight them at all. It hit him then, the real twist of fate. This wasn't about a billionaire's pride or a child's charity. It was about survival. Lila's world wasn't measured in billions, but in moments like this, where safety itself was a luxury. And he, Alexander Crown, who had everything, had never felt more stripped bare. Come, he said, his voice softer now. Let me walk you home. And as they stepped deeper into the night, Alexander had no idea that Lila's home, her truth, would soon break him in ways even bankruptcy never could. Because what awaited them behind her front door was a revelation that would change both of their lives forever. They walked through the city's underbelly, where the streetlights grew fewer and the glow of wealth disappeared. The air thickened with dampness, graffiti splattered across brick walls, and the hum of neon was replaced by the creak of broken signs. Lila's steps were small but steady, guiding Alexander deeper into a part of the city he had never seen, not because it was hidden, but because men like him had never needed to look. Finally, she stopped in front of a building that seemed to sag under its own weight. The paint peeled like old scabs, windows were covered in cardboard, and the front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. She pushed it open with effort, glancing back as though embarrassed. This is home, she whispered. Inside, the stairwell reeked of mildew. The walls were damp, plaster crumbling like sand beneath a fingertip. Alexander's polished shoes splashed in puddles on the floor, and every step up the creaking staircase felt like a descent into a world far removed from his own. When they reached the small apartment, Lila unlocked the door with a bent key. The room inside was dim, a single bulb buzzing weakly above. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, and in the corner lay a thin mattress where a woman, frail, pale, coughing into a rag, struggled to sit up. Mama, Lila said softly, rushing forward. I brought someone. The woman looked up, her face etched with exhaustion, her body weakened by illness. Alexander's heart clenched. He had seen countless faces across his empire, employees, investors, rivals, but never one that struck him with such raw humanity. This woman had the look of someone fighting battles no wealth could shield her from. Who is he? Her mother asked, her voice rasping. A friend, Lila said simply. He needed help tonight. The word friend hung in the air. Alexander had been called many things, boss, mogul, tycoon, but never that. Certainly not by a child he had only just met. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Your daughter, she's remarkable. Her mother's lips curved into the faintest smile. She's all I have. And in that moment, Alexander saw it all. The unpaid medical bills scattered on the table, the half-empty bottle of medicine, the fridge humming with emptiness in the corner. This wasn't just poverty. It was survival teetering on the edge of collapse. He felt a rush of shame unlike anything before. For years, his wealth had blinded him. He had walked past countless Lilas shielded by tinted car windows and high-rise walls. He had convinced himself their struggles were not his responsibility. But here, standing in this fragile room, he saw the cost of that blindness. Lila pressed her coin purse into her mother's hand. I tried to use it to help him. But maybe it can help us instead. Tears burned behind Alexander's eyes. The child who had nothing had still tried to give everything, and in that instant, Alexander made a silent vow. He would not leave this place unchanged, but keeping that vow would force him into one final confrontation, one that would demand he risk not only his pride, but everything he thought he valued. Alexander stood in the center of that small, dimly lit apartment, his chest heavy with emotions he hadn't felt in years. The billionaire who once believed money could buy the world was staring at a reality money had overlooked. A child's courage and a mother's silent suffering. He sat quietly on the edge of a battered chair, watching Lila fuss over her mother, tucking a blanket around her shoulders with hands far too small for the weight they carried. It was then he realized. This little girl was already living the battles he had run from as a boy. Hunger, cold humiliation. The very things he had buried under skyscrapers and bank accounts. "Lila," Alexander said gently, his voice thick. "Do you always take care of her like this?" She nodded. "I try. Sometimes the neighbors help when Mama gets worse. But it's hard. People don't really listen when kids ask for help." Her words landed like stones in his heart. People didn't listen. He had built his empire on being the man people had to listen to, yet this child's pleas for help had gone unheard. Her mother tried to sit straighter, her fragile hands trembling. "We manage. God provides." Alexander shook his head, overwhelmed by the contrast between her faith and his pride. For years he had worshipped wealth, convinced it was his God, and yet here was a family with nothing but faith and love, and somehow they were richer than him. Something broke inside him. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet, though he knew the cards inside were frozen, worthless. Instead, he placed the wallet on the table like an offering and said the words he never imagined he could. "I can't promise you much tonight, but I will fix this. Not just dinner, not just a bill. Your lives." The room was silent. Lila blinked up at him, her eyes wide. "Why?" she whispered. Alexander leaned closer, his voice low, raw, stripped of all armor. "Because once, a long time ago, I was like you, hungry, scared, alone, and I swore I'd never feel that way again. But tonight, I realized I've forgotten who I was. You reminded me." Lila's mother's eyes glistened. Lila herself just smiled, the pure, unshaken smile of a child who believed him. That night became the turning point. In the weeks that followed, Alexander made good on his vow. Quietly at first, then boldly. He paid off their debts, arranged proper medical care for Lila's mother, and moved them into a safer home. But it didn't stop there. The man once obsessed with empires turned his fortune into something else. Schools, shelters, medical clinics. Not for the sake of headlines, but because a little girl with a coin purse had reminded him what wealth truly meant. And though the world eventually forgot the scandal of a billionaire's declined card, Alexander never forgot the night a poor child saved him, not with money, but with the unthinkable act of kindness. Because in that single moment, when the world laughed at his fall, she chose to lift him up, and that was a debt no fortune could ever repay.